In the summer of 2026, a former central banker sat across a table from the most unpredictable president in modern American history, and instead of raising his voice, he did something far more dangerous. He waited. For 18 months, Donald Trump had used tariffs the way a boxer uses jabs, testing reflexes, looking for the moment his opponent would flinch. Canada had flinched before. Under a different leader, it had matched threat with threat, tariff with tariff, in a tit-for-tat exchange that rattled markets on both sides of the border. But the man now standing at the podium in Ottawa was not a career politician. He was Mark Carney, the only person in history to have run two G7 central banks. And the question hanging over this entire standoff was whether a man trained to read economic panic for a living was about to outmaneuver a president who had built his political brand on being unpredictable. What happened over the following months would test that theory in real time. And by the end of it, even seasoned trade lawyers in Washington would admit they had not seen anything quite like it. To understand why this moment mattered, it helps to go back to February 1st, 2025, the day Donald Trump signed the executive orders that started it all. Citing the flow of fentanyl across the northern border, he imposed a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy. It was framed as a border security measure, but economists on both sides of the line saw it differently. Fentanyl seizures at the Canadian border were a fraction of those at the Mexican border, and yet Canada, America's largest single trading partner, was being treated as an equivalent threat. Justin Trudeau, still Prime Minister at the time, responded within days, announcing retaliatory tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods, with a second wave planned that would eventually cover roughly 125 billion more. Grocery store shelves in Nova Scotia were stripped of American liquor within a week. It was fast, it was symbolic, and it set the tone for what would become one of the longest sustained trade disputes between the two countries in living memory. Then, in March 2025, the man tasked with managing this crisis changed. Mark Carney, who had spent the previous 2 decades steering the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, and later the Bank of England through Brexit, was chosen to lead the Liberal Party and became Prime Minister. His resume was unlike that of almost any predecessor in Canadian history. He had never held elected office before taking the country's top job, arriving instead from a career spent reading interest rate curves, currency markets, and the subtle language central bankers use to move billions of dollars without ever raising their voice. That background shaped how he talked about the tariff fight from the very beginning. In his first speech as Liberal leader, he promised to eliminate the domestic carbon tax and to fight the American tariffs directly. But the tone of that promise was notably different from the combative rhetoric that had defined the opening weeks of the dispute under Trudeau. He inherited a fight that was already well underway, and he made clear that Canada would not back down, while also signaling that it would not act out of anger. Where Trudeau's government had leaned on public confrontation, grocery boycotts, and rapid retaliatory announcements, Carney's approach was noticeably different from the start. Methodical, quiet, almost clinical. The kind of posture you would expect from someone who had spent his career reading markets rather than crowds, and who understood that panic, once it enters an economic system, tends to do more damage than the initial shock that caused it. By the summer of 2025, the trade war had metastasized well beyond the original tariffs. Washington added duties on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, industries that sit at the heart of the deeply integrated supply chains connecting Ontario's auto plants to Michigan's assembly lines. Vehicles routinely cross the border multiple times during production before they are finished, which meant a blanket tariff didn't just hurt Canadian exporters, it raised costs for American manufacturers too. Carney called the auto tariffs a direct attack on Canadian workers and pledged retaliatory measures, while simultaneously working behind the scenes to keep the broader relationship from collapsing entirely. It was a balancing act that would define his entire approach, publicly firm, privately searching for an off-ramp. That off-ramp appeared to arrive at the end of August 2025. In a move that caught many observers off guard, Canada quietly withdrew the majority of its retaliatory tariffs, effective September 1st, keeping only the countermeasures on steel, aluminum, and automobiles in place. The official reasoning was that the United States had allowed most Canadian goods to continue entering tariff-free under the existing North American trade agreement, and Carney's government judged that maintaining a full retaliatory posture no longer served Canadian exporters more than it hurt them. Critics called it a retreat. Carney's team called it strategy. The truth, as it would later become clear, was closer to the second explanation because the fight was about to shift from the political arena into a courtroom. And that is where the story takes its first genuinely unexpected turn. For more than a year, a coalition of American importers and business owners, including a small educational toy company called Learning Resources, had been challenging the legal foundation beneath nearly all of Trump's sweeping tariffs. Their argument was simple but consequential. The president had used a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a statute originally designed to let presidents freeze assets and impose sanctions during genuine national emergencies, and stretched it to justify blanket tariffs on trading partners. No president had ever used that law this way before. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision written by Chief Justice John Roberts that IEEPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs at all. The ruling didn't just strike down the Canada-specific measures, it invalidated the so-called Liberation Day tariffs imposed on dozens of countries around the world, and it opened the door to what analysts estimated could be well over $160 billion in refunds owed to American importers who had already paid the disputed duties. For a brief moment, it looked like the entire trade war might unwind through the courts rather than through negotiation. It didn't happen that way. Within hours of the ruling, Trump signed a new proclamation invoking a different, far less commonly used law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, imposing a 10% global tariff, later reported to be moving toward 15%, on imports from most countries, though goods compliant with the North American Trade Agreement were initially spared. It was a signal that the legal defeat had not changed the underlying strategy. It had only forced a change in the paperwork. For Canadian exporters who had spent a year restructuring supply chains around one set of rules, it meant bracing for another round of uncertainty under a completely different statute, one that gave the president even less room for the kind of open-ended, emergency-based justification the Supreme Court had just rejected. What the ruling did make clear, and what should have worried Ottawa more than it initially seemed to, was that Trump's tariff strategy was never really about a single law or a single justification. It was about leverage. And leverage can be manufactured under almost any legal framework if a president is determined enough to keep trying. That pattern repeated itself again on July 20th, 2026, when Trump signed an order under yet another obscure statute, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law dating back nearly a century that had essentially never been used to impose tariffs before. This time the target was specific. A 50% duty on Canadian goods across more than 550 tariff lines, worth roughly $20 billion, covering everything from honey and dairy to cement, hockey sticks, and spirits. The administration framed it as retaliation for what it called discriminatory Canadian treatment of American dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicles. The tariffs were set to take effect on August 19, 2026, giving both sides a 30-day window that Carney would later describe carefully as both an opportunity and a threat. Carney's response revealed something about how he had learned to operate inside this relationship. On the very morning the Section 338 order was announced, he called Trump directly. Afterward, he told reporters in Ottawa that the two leaders had agreed to intensify and accelerate negotiations over the coming weeks, a statement notable for what it didn't include. No threats, no countdown of his own, no public ultimatum. It was only 3 days later, after meeting with all 13 Canadian premiers and territorial leaders in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, that his tone shifted to something more guarded. Everything is on the table, he told reporters, depending on the outcome of negotiations, adding that he would not detail Canada's retaliatory options in advance because doing so would hand the other side a roadmap. When a journalist asked whether the August 19th deadline was a genuine opportunity for a final deal or simply a pressure tactic, Carney's answer was direct. It's both. Behind that composed public messaging, the meeting in Charlottetown exposed something the cameras rarely capture in these situations. Real disagreement among Canada's own leadership about how hard to hit back. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province's auto sector sits directly in the blast radius of any new tariffs, pushed for aggressive countermeasures, telling reporters Canada needed to respond with everything it had until Washington felt genuine pain, and specifically calling for export restrictions on potash, critical minerals, and energy, resources that, notably, sat outside the scope of the new tariffs entirely. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith took the opposite position, warning that weaponizing oil exports would not work for her province and risked damaging Alberta's own economy far more than it would pressure the United States. Reporting at the time noted that further retaliation using energy exports was not widely supported by economists either, since disrupting integrated North American energy markets tends to raise costs for both countries roughly in tandem. The disagreement mattered because it revealed that Carney's calm public posture wasn't simply personal temperament, it was also political necessity, holding together a federation of premiers who did not agree among themselves about how far to push back. Then, in a development that captured just how unpredictable this relationship had become, Trump opened an entirely new front that had nothing to do with trade balances or dairy quotas. On July 25th, he told reporters he intended to impose a tariff on Canada over wildfire smoke drifting south across the border, an issue tied to Canada's severe 2025 and 2026 wildfire seasons. Trade policy experts were blunt about the claim. Laura Dawson of the Future Borders Coalition told Canadian media there was no basis whatsoever in trade law for using smoke as grounds for a tariff, since existing statutes are built around unfair trade practices, national security, or economic emergencies, not atmospheric conditions. Whether the threat was ever seriously intended to become policy or was simply another pressure tactic designed to keep Ottawa off balance remained unclear, but it underscored a pattern that had become increasingly visible. The justifications kept shifting, while the underlying goal, extracting concessions from Canada, stayed constant. By late July 2026, a second, separate tariff had already taken effect alongside the looming 50% duty, a 10% measure applied to Canada and dozens of other countries over allegations of forced labor violations in supply chains, imposed under Section 301 of the Trade Act, and covering an estimated 99% of all U.S. imports. It replaced a temporary global tariff that had just expired, meaning Canadian exporters were now navigating overlapping tariff regimes stacked on top of one another, each with different legal justifications, different exemptions, and different expiration conditions, an administrative maze that trade lawyers themselves struggled to fully map in real time. The economic stakes behind all of this are not abstract. Independent analysis circulated among Canadian officials warned that beyond the direct cost of the tariffs themselves, the heightened uncertainty could dampen business confidence and curb investment plans across the country, with Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia identified as the provinces likely to be hit hardest. The same three provinces that together account for the overwhelming majority of Canada's manufacturing output and population. On the American side, the picture was more complicated than a simple story of one country losing and another winning. The United States exports roughly $23 billion worth of passenger vehicles into Canada each year, $16 billion more than Germany sends across the Atlantic, a detail that undercuts any narrative in which tariffs only inflict damage in one direction. Because vehicle parts routinely cross the Canada-US border several times during assembly, a tariff imposed in Washington raises costs for factories in Michigan and Ohio, just as surely as it raises costs for plants in Windsor and Oshawa. Labor Department figures released around the same time showed American job growth slowing sharply, with economists citing tariff-driven uncertainty as one of several factors making companies reluctant to expand hiring until the trade picture stabilized, a signal that the costs of this standoff were not confined to one side of the border, even if the political rhetoric on both sides often suggested otherwise. That mutual exposure is precisely what makes Carney's strategy of restraint a calculated bet rather than simple caution. As a former central bank governor, he built his career on understanding how uncertainty itself functions as an economic force, sometimes more damaging than any single policy change. Businesses postpone investment not necessarily because a tariff is high, but because they cannot predict whether it will still exist in 6 months. By refusing to escalate reflexively and instead keeping retaliatory options undisclosed, Carney appears to be betting that the psychological and economic toll of prolonged unpredictability will eventually weigh on American businesses and consumers heavily enough to bring Washington back to a negotiating posture, without Canada needing to inflict that damage through aggressive countermeasures of its own. It is a strategy that assumes economic self-interest will eventually override political theater, an assumption that has not always held true over the past year and a half. And then, on July 28th, just 3 weeks before the 50% tariffs were due to take effect, Trump gave an interview that seemed to undercut the entire premise that a negotiated resolution was even the goal. Speaking by phone to a morning news program, he was asked directly whether he wanted to preserve or update the trade agreement binding the United States, Canada, and Mexico together. His answer left little room for interpretation. He said he didn't particularly care whether the agreement survived, that he would rather operate independently, and that Canada and Mexico needed the American market far more than the United States needed theirs. The comment landed on the same day Canadian officials confirmed that Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc was traveling to Washington for another round of talks, creating an uncomfortable split-screen moment. Ottawa scrambling to save a framework that the President of the United States was, in the same news cycle, publicly dismissing as unnecessary. This is the paradox sitting at the center of the entire standoff, and it is the biggest unanswered question hanging over the next 3 weeks. Carney has built his entire strategy around the belief that patient, business-like negotiation, backed by the credible threat of retaliation rather than its immediate use, can eventually produce a durable agreement, the kind of deal that survives beyond a single administration or a single deadline. But that strategy assumes the other side is negotiating toward an outcome, when the available evidence increasingly suggests the American president may view the ongoing uncertainty itself as advantageous, a permanent source of leverage rather than a temporary state to be resolved. Carney has acknowledged this tension himself, telling reporters that even if an agreement is reached, both his negotiating team and the premiers will need to be convinced it is worth the paper it's written on. A striking admission from a sitting prime minister about the durability of any deal struck with a sitting American president. What happens on or before August 19th will answer some of these questions, though almost certainly not all of them. If Canada and the United States reach a comprehensive agreement before the deadline, it would mark the first durable resolution to a conflict that has now stretched across a year and a half, 2 different American legal justifications for tariffs, 1 landmark Supreme Court ruling, and visible cracks in Canada's own domestic unity over how forcefully to respond. If no agreement materializes, Canada faces a choice its own premiers have not agreed on. Match the 50% tariff with proportional retaliation of its own, restrict exports of resources the United States genuinely depends on, or continue Carney's now familiar approach of measured restraint, betting that economic damage on the American side, rising consumer prices, disrupted auto supply chains, angry manufacturers, will eventually force Washington back to the table on Canada's terms rather than its own. What is verifiable right now is this. The trade relationship between 2 countries that share the longest undefended border on Earth, a relationship built over 8 decades of integrated supply chains, shared energy grids, and mutual defense commitments, has been fundamentally renegotiated through a rotating sequence of tariffs, legal challenges, and reversals, with no single stable endpoint yet in sight. The 2020 agreement that was supposed to provide predictability for exactly this kind of dispute was never renewed, leaving both governments to negotiate a replacement that could, under current timelines, stretch out for another decade. Mark Carney has staked his prime ministership on the bet that composure beats confrontation, that a central banker's instinct for reading volatility without panicking can succeed where louder, more combative approaches have not. Whether that bet pays off will not be decided by a single tariff deadline in August, but by whether either country can rebuild something that has already been proven, repeatedly, to be more fragile than either side assumed. Trust between neighbors who no longer agree on what they owe each other.